Hello everyone. Tonight we're diving into a story about why being a knight wasn't as glamorous as the movies would have you believe. It's a tale of honour, duty and the quiet cost of power, written in the style of a medieval confession. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, give this video a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe let the gentle hum of a fan fill the room, and let's step together into the silence of another century. I am old now. My hands shake when I pour wine, and the grip I once took for granted has become something I must rebuild each morning, flexing fingers stiff as winter branches until the blood remembers its work. The sword hangs above the hearth where I will not touch it. Some men polish their weapons in their final years, as if preparing for one last ride. I have learned better. Steel does not improve with time. It only rusts, just as men do. My name is Sir Edmund Thorne, though the title sits strange on me now, like armour worn by a man no longer meant to bear it. I was born in the year of our Lord, 1348, in a manor near Nottingham, during those years when England still believed itself invincible. I write this now in the autumn of 1394, 66 years into a life I scarcely recognise as my own. The world has changed, or perhaps it has only revealed what it always was, and I was simply too young to see the rot beneath the gold. You will find no glory in what I tell you. If you have come seeking tales of noble deeds and righteous causes, you might turn back now. What follows is only the account of one man who wore a knight's cross and learned too slowly that the cross meant nothing but the weight it carried. I should begin where all men begin, with a child who knew nothing yet, who thought the world was ordered and just, who believed that honour meant something beyond the counting house and the throne room. That boy was myself, though I have no kinship with him now. I cannot even remember his face without effort, only the sensation of being small beneath cathedral ceilings, only the smell of horse and hay, only the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder as he presented me to the master-at-arms. My father was Thomas Thorne, a man of middling fortune who held his lands by service rather than inheritance. This is an important thing to understand if you are to follow what comes after. There was no ancient blood in our veins, no castle passed down through generations of warrior kings. We were the sort of family that kept itself alive by being useful. My father had fought in France during the earlier years of the war with the French, that long grinding conflict that our elders called a glorious enterprise, and that we children knew only as the reason certain neighbours never returned home. He had received his knighthood not for great deeds, but for steady service, and, I suspect now, for possessing land that the Crown found convenient to control. When I was 14 years old, I was sent to the household of Sir William Ashford, a knight of greater standing than my father, who held lands nearer to London. This was a common arrangement, and I thought little of it at the time. I was excited. My mother wept, but quietly, as women of her station were trained to do. I remember the morning of my departure more clearly than I remember my own mother's face now, which is perhaps the first small treachery that war and time commit against a man. We rode for 3 days. The roads were rutted and thick with mud. It had rained for a week, and the autumn smell of decay hung heavy over everything. Apples rotted in the orchards we passed. The fields were being stripped of their final harvest, and the labourers moved with the slow, exhausted precision of men who had been bending under the weight of the season since spring. I remember thinking it all looked like something from the paintings in church windows, the ordered world of Christian hierarchy, where every soul knew its place and found contentment in service. How much less I knew then about the true nature of that hierarchy than I believed. Sir William's household was a fortress of routine and discipline. The castle itself was modest by the standards of greater lords, but to my eyes it appeared vast and ancient. It was built in the previous century during a time when men were still afraid of raids across the Channel, and its walls were thick enough to withstand a siege. I would later learn that the wall's thickness had less to do with French threats, and more to do with the common practice of lords defending their wealth against their own tenants and neighbouring nobility. But that knowledge came later, earned through the slow education that only experience provides. I was brought to the Master-at-Arms on the morning after my arrival. His name was Godric, and he was a man of perhaps 50 years, with a scarred face that told the story of someone who had been struck across the cheek by a blade at some point in his youth. The scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, pale and twisted, and it drew the eye in a way that made you forget the rest of his features. I learned later that he had taken that mark at the siege of Berwick, fighting against the Scots, and that he bore it without shame. It was, in his view, the mark of a man who had lived. Godric showed me no mercy, though he showed me no cruelty either. Something I learned to distinguish only with time. He was simply practical. He assessed me as a man might assess a horse, noting my height, my reach, my balance, my strength. Then he set about the work of breaking me down and rebuilding me as something that might be useful in the field. I spent the next 8 years in this work. 8 years of rising before dawn, of drilling with sword and spear, until my arms screamed with a pain so constant that I eventually stopped noticing it. 8 years of falling off horses, learning to roll without breaking bones, understanding the mechanics of how a man's body might be made useful as an instrument of war. 8 years of eating poorly, sleeping on straw, catching diseases that I survived only through the indifference of my youth. 8 years of being beaten by older squires, when I failed to perform the endless small tasks that made up the daily life of a knight in training, polishing armour, grooming horses, carrying firewood, preparing meals. There is something about this kind of suffering that shapes a man before he knows what shape means. You do not think about it as suffering while you are experiencing it. You think only of the next meal, the next moment of rest, the next small success that earns you a word of approval rather than a strike. I became strong. My hands developed calluses thick enough that fire did not particularly hurt them. I could stay awake for 2 days and still function. I learned to ignore hunger, thirst, cold and pain as if they were merely weather unpleasant, but ultimately irrelevant to the business at hand. I learned other things too, though these lessons came more subtly, woven into the fabric of daily life in the household. I learned hierarchy in its purest form. At the bottom were the servants and the labourers, men and women, who existed to serve everyone above them. Above them were the minor household staff, the cooks, the blacksmiths, the stable hands. Above these were the soldiers and guards. Above them were the upper servants, the steward, the constable, men of some education and standing. And then, far above, were the knights. The knights lived in a different world from the rest of the household, though they occupied the same physical space. They ate better food. Their halls were warmer. They were permitted to wear fine clothes and ornaments. They were addressed by title and shown deference, and they answered only to the lord or to other knights of greater standing. This was presented to me not as an arbitrary arrangement, but as the natural order of things, the way God had arranged creation. The priest who said Mass in Sir William's chapel spoke of this hierarchy as if it were written into the very substance of the world, and I believed it. Or perhaps it is more honest to say that I accepted it, the way you accept gravity, or weather. Questioning such fundamental arrangements seemed as pointless as questioning why the sky was blue. I was knighted on my 23rd birthday, in the year 1371. The ceremony took place in the great hall of Sir William's castle, on a day in early summer, when the light came thick and golden through the high windows. I remember the weight of the sword as the priest blessed it. I remember kneeling before Sir William himself, this man who had employed me as a boy, and feeling the flat of his own sword strike my shoulders, a gesture that transformed me, in the eyes of the world, from a squire into a knight. The transformation was real, though it consisted only of a moment, an action and a blessing. But it was real. My clothes changed, my duties changed, my status changed. Men who had beaten me years before now addressed me with deference. Women who had ignored me began to notice me. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I truly belonged to something larger than myself, a brotherhood of warriors, a tradition stretching back to the days of the Crusades, perhaps even to the time of King Arthur and the Knights of Legend. I did not know it then, but that ceremony was the highest point of my life. Everything that came after was either its echo or its betrayal. Within 6 months, I had been given my first commission. Sir William required a knight to ride north to Yorkshire to collect taxes owed by a minor lord, who had been neglecting his obligations to the crown. This was not the kind of work I had imagined when I dreamed of knighthood. I had pictured great battles and noble quests, not the mundane business of tax collection. But this is one of the first truths that a young knight must learn. Knighthood is, for most men, primarily an instrument of royal administration. We were enforcers, administrators, the visible hand of a king's will extended across the vast distance of his realm. I rode north with a small company of 4 men-at-arms, experienced soldiers but not knights themselves. We rode for 4 days, passing through countryside that grew steadily wilder and less ordered. As we moved away from the heartland of England, the roads became rutted tracks. The villages grew smaller and more suspicious. The people we encountered looked at us with an expression that I struggled to read then, but now understand perfectly. Resignation mixed with barely concealed resentment. The lord we sought was named Sir Robert Dacre. He held a modest estate in the valleys near the border with Scotland, a region that was less part of England's ordered hierarchy and more part of a lawless frontier where men conducted their affairs with a directness that shocked me. Dacre's castle was smaller than I had expected, more of a fortified manor house, and his household was rough and military in character. There was no pretense of ceremony here, no formal structure of household life. Men sat where they wished at meals. Conversations were loud and often obscene. Women moved through the halls with a frankness that I found disturbing. Dacre himself was a man in his late 50s, weather-beaten and scarred in a way that suggested he had fought in many campaigns. He received me with courtesy, but also with a barely concealed amusement at what he seemed to regard as my formality and youth. The king's little dogs, he called me and my men, not unkindly. Come to collect his bones. The matter of the unpaid taxes proved more complicated than I had anticipated. Dacre claimed that the harvest had been poor, that his tenants were suffering, that the king's demands were unreasonable given the state of his lands. Some of this may have been true. Some of it was certainly evasion. But in any case, Dacre had the audacity to refuse me. Not in so many words, he was too experienced for such crude directness, but through the simple mechanism of claiming he did not possess the coin and would not permit the seizure of his land's goods. This was a direct challenge to the authority I represented. I had been sent by Sir William, who represented the crown. To accept Dacre's refusal would be to accept a diminishment of that authority, and yet I had only 4 men, while Dacre could call upon perhaps 30 soldiers of his own. I spent a sleepless night in Dacre's castle, lying on a straw mattress in a cold stone room, wondering what I should do. I considered riding back to Sir William and admitting failure. I considered attempting to seize the lands by force, knowing that I would almost certainly be killed in the attempt. I considered simply leaving and pretending that the matter was settled. In the morning, Dacre sought me out. He had apparently slept well and seemed amused by my obvious distress. He invited me to ride out with him to see his lands. I accepted, and we rode for several hours through the Yorkshire valleys. Dacre showed me his fields, his village, his livestock. He showed me, without ever directly saying so, that he was not destitute, but was rather engaging in a form of negotiation. When we returned to his castle, he offered me a solution. He could not pay the full amount immediately, but he could pay a portion now and undertake to pay the remainder over the next 3 months. Additionally, he offered me a gift, a fine horse, young and strong, of a quality I could not have afforded myself. The gift was wrapped in courtesy and friendship, but its meaning was clear. This was a bribe, an investment in future understanding. I accepted the arrangement and the horse. I told myself that I was exercising judgment, that I was being practical rather than rigid. I did not tell myself, though I knew it perfectly well, that I was being corrupted. When I returned to Sir William's household, he accepted the partial payment without comment. He seemed unsurprised. He asked no questions about the negotiations or the horse. This silence told me more than any words could have. It told me that such arrangements were expected, that the business of collecting taxes was less about filling the royal treasury and more about establishing patterns of leverage and obligation. Every payment delayed created a debt. Every bribe accepted created an alliance. The actual coin that reached the crown was almost secondary to the networks of obligation that were being woven through the fabric of society. This was perhaps the first moment when I began to see clearly, though I did not fully understand what I was seeing, the world I had been taught to regard as orderly and hierarchical, a system in which everyone knew their place, and everyone served the will of God, and the king was actually something far more chaotic and self-interested. Loyalty was a currency that could be traded. Honor was a word used to describe the arrangements made between men of power. Service meant doing whatever was necessary to maintain your position and advance your interests. But I was young, and my discomfort with these revelations was still outweighed by my desire to belong to the order that I was entering. I pushed these thoughts away. I focused on the immediate and the tangible, the skill in horsemanship that I was developing, the strength I had built in my arms and shoulders, the respect that men showed me now that I wore the title of knight. Over the next decade, I was sent on similar commissions throughout the English realm. I collected taxes in Lancashire and Sussex. I arrested a rebel priest in Kent who had been preaching that the poor were equal in God's eyes, a dangerous idea that apparently needed suppressing. I participated in the dispersal of a group of armed peasants in Essex who were refusing to pay their labour obligations to their lord. I witnessed, in these latter events, the moment when words about order and hierarchy encountered the actual resistance of human beings who felt that the system was unjust, and I saw how order was maintained through force, through the threat of force, through the casual use of violence that never appeared in histories but was nonetheless the foundation upon which everything rested. And yet, I was changing. The person I was becoming was not the idealistic young knight who had felt the sword strike his shoulders for the first time. I was becoming practical. I was becoming careful. I was learning not to ask too many questions about the purposes of my work. This was not a dramatic transformation. There was no moment when I consciously chose this path. It was simply the slow erosion that comes from doing practical work in service of purposes that, if examined too closely, would not bear scrutiny. I was, in short, becoming the kind of man that the world required. In the year 1377, when I was in my 29th year, the great peasant rebellion erupted. You may know of this from the histories that priests and scholars write. You may have heard of Wat Tyler and his march on London, of the demands for the abolition of serfdom and the redistribution of land. You may know that the rebellion was crushed, that its leaders were brought to the end of their lives' paths in ways designed to be public and horrifying, that afterwards the laws were made even more stringent against peasants, that those who had dared to dream of a different order were punished and terrified back into submission. What you are less likely to know is what it felt like to be caught in the middle of that upheaval, neither a peasant with nothing to lose, nor a great lord with the resources to rule in the rebellion's aftermath. You are less likely to understand what it felt like to suddenly see that the order you had been trained to serve was not as stable as it had seemed, that the people at the bottom, people you had scarcely thought of as fully human, so completely did they exist in a separate world, were capable of rising up and threatening everything that you had been taught, mattered. I was in London when the rebellion reached its peak. I had been summoned to court on business relating to a dispute over lands between two minor nobles' work that kept me in the city for several weeks. The court itself was in an uproar. There was discussion of the peasants' demands, which seemed to the great lords to be not merely mistaken but actively heretical. The idea that a peasant might claim rights equal to his lord's, that a man born to service might imagine himself capable of governing. These notions were treated as outrageous violations of natural law. And yet there was also fear. The fear that men feel when they suddenly realize that the systems they have built do not rest upon anything more solid than habit and force. That if enough people stopped accepting their subordinate positions, if enough people stopped believing in the justice of their own subjection, then the whole elaborate structure would collapse. The city had been warned that Tyler's forces were approaching. I saw the preparations additional guards stationed at gates, patrols increased, wealthy families preparing to flee. I remember standing on a bridge over the Thames and seeing a strange mixture of commerce and preparation. Merchants were trying to conduct their business as usual, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that something fundamental was happening. The rebellion was crushed, as you probably know. Tyler himself was brought down by an archer while attempting to negotiate with the young king. His followers were scattered and hunted, and afterwards, in the reckonings that followed, I learned what happens when those who hold power feel genuinely threatened. The responses were not measured or just, they were terrified and vengeful. I was not directly involved in the executions that followed, though I was present in the city while they were happening. I remember the smell, though, a thing that I have tried many times to forget and have never succeeded. The smell of bodies that have hung long enough for decay to begin, in the heat of a London summer. The smell of human waste, because that is what the dying body releases. The smell of fear and pain made physical. They hanged rebels from the gates of the city. They quartered some. A punishment so thorough and so designed to humiliate that I will not describe it more precisely than to say that the body was destroyed methodically in ways that revealed that those administering the punishment had thought carefully about the business of causing maximum suffering. These men were ordinary labourers and craftspeople, people who had wanted more dignity in their lives, and their punishment was presented as necessary, as right, as the only possible response to their outrageous presumption. I went to confession after witnessing these executions. The priest told me that I need not feel troubled by what I had seen. The maintenance of order sometimes required harsh measures, he said. The peace of the realm was worth the suffering of those who threatened it. God himself had ordained that some men rule and others serve, and to resist this order was to resist God's will. But I felt troubled nonetheless, though I did not fully understand why. Something in me that was not yet entirely dead recognized that there was a difference between this and the noble violence that I had been trained to imagine. This was not battle. It was not the clash of forces in open conflict. This was the exercise of absolute power over those who could not resist, dressed up in the language of necessity and order. That night, I dreamed for the first time the dream that would return to me many times in the years that followed. I was standing in a field at dawn, a field that I did not recognize but somehow understood as English soil. The ground beneath my feet was soft, not mud, but something thicker, something that seemed to drink down into the earth as though the earth itself was thirsty. The sky above was grey and empty, and all around me, rising slowly from the ground as though emerging from sleep, were men in armour. They were indistinct. I could not see their faces, but I knew that I knew them. They rose slowly, silently, and turned to look at me with eyes that held no accusation and no forgiveness. They simply looked, and in their looking was an understanding that something had been taken from them, something that they had believed was sacred, and that I had been present in that theft. I woke in darkness, my heart hammering, my skin wet with sweat. I did not go back to sleep that night. I lay awake and felt something shift in myself, something crack in the foundations of the structure that I had built to justify my life and my choices. But I did not acknowledge this directly. That is one of the talents that men develop when their conscience becomes inconvenient, the talent for looking away, for finding reasons to stay busy, for filling the days with activity so that there is no time for reflection. I threw myself into my duties with renewed energy. I trained harder. I rode farther. I became even more careful in performing the tasks I was assigned. It was during this period that I met the woman who would, for a time, convince me that there might be something like happiness available to me in this life. Her name was Margaret, and she was the daughter of a prosperous merchant in London. She was not beautiful, or at least, I would not have called her beautiful. She had a face that was too angular, eyes that were too intelligent, a way of speaking that was too direct. But she was interesting in a way that I had not encountered before. She did not seem to regard the world as a fixed thing, but rather as something that might be changed by those with the will to change it. We met at court, at a Christmas celebration in the year 1380. She was there because her father had given money to the king, money that was desperately needed to fund wars in France, and had received an invitation to the festivities in return. I was there in my capacity as a knight, though I had no particular role at court that year. We spoke briefly that evening, a conversation that touched on nothing of importance, the quality of the wine, the music being played, the cold of the winter. But something in the conversation drew me back to seek her out the next day. Over the course of several weeks we spent more time together. We walked in the garden of the palace, attended mass together, shared meals. She asked me questions about my life as a knight, and she listened to my answers in a way that suggested she was genuinely curious, rather than merely being polite. She spoke to me about her own life, about her father's business, about her education, which was unusual for a woman of her class. But her father had valued learning and had arranged for her to be taught letters and languages, along with the domestic arts. What I felt for her I would have called love at the time. Now, when I am old and have learned to be more precise about my own feelings, I would call it relief. She offered me a world in which things might make sense, in which there might be an alternative to the endless compromises and corruptions that filled my days. She suggested, without ever directly saying so, that there might be a life beyond the pursuit of power and status, a life that had value for its own sake. We were married in the spring of 1381, with the blessing of both our families. My lands were modest but stable, and the match improved her father's standing with the nobility. It seemed, for a moment, that I had achieved the kind of happiness that was considered the proper portion of a man in my station: a good marriage, secure lands, respected position. I believed, during this period, that I might escape the trajectory that I had been following, that I might be able to step back from the business of enforcing the king's will and live a quieter life, managing my lands and my household, perhaps raising children who might have different choices than I had had. I had not yet understood that the world does not permit such escapes. Men in positions of power do not simply allow those beneath them to withdraw from service. The king's need for knights does not diminish because a knight wishes to be left alone. In 1388, when I was 40 years old, I received a summons to court. The message was polite, but the underlying command was absolute. The king, Richard II, who had been a child when the peasant rebellion occurred, but was now a young man, wished me to undertake a commission on his behalf. I was to gather a force of soldiers and travel to the lands of the Earl of Northumberland, where certain disputes had arisen regarding the management of royal forests and the collection of taxes. I was to settle these disputes by whatever means necessary and report back to the court on the state of the nobility in that region. I did not want to go. Margaret begged me not to go. She'd given me 2 children by that point, a son and a daughter, and she argued that I had obligations to them, that I should not abandon my family to wander the country at the king's pleasure. But the summons was not a request, and there was no honourable way to refuse it. To refuse would have been to risk losing my lands, my title, my position, everything that I had built. So I prepared my armour, gathered a company of soldiers and rode away from my family in the spring of 1388. I did not return home for 2 years. The journey to Northumberland took me through the English Midlands and north, through a landscape that grew steadily grimmer and more remote as I travelled away from the heart of the kingdom. The weather was poor heavy rains that turned the roads into rivers of mud, early frosts that made the nights almost unbearably cold. My men suffered from illness and injury. We lost 3 of them to fever before we had been on the road for a month, and others developed infections from minor wounds that seemed not to heal properly in the cold and damp. I learned during this journey the truth about the nobility of England in these years. It was not the unified, hierarchical structure that I had been taught to believe. It was fractious, suspicious, full of ancient rivalries and new grievances. The Earl of Northumberland himself, Henry Percy, a man of about my own age, was engaged in complex negotiations with other northern lords over the borders of their territories, the rights to certain forests, the command of the region's military forces. The dispute that I had been sent to settle was not a matter of clear right and wrong. It was a matter of power, and the outcome would depend largely on what outcome would best serve the king's interests. This was a revelation to me, though perhaps it should not have been. I had witnessed similar dynamics on a smaller scale in my previous work, but now I saw them operating at the level of the great nobility, and I understood that everything I had been told about the ordering of the realm was fundamentally misleading. The king sat at the apex, yes, but his power was constantly being negotiated and contested by the great lords beneath him. Justice was not an abstract principle, but a matter of which lord held more soldiers, which lord had closer connections to power, which lord could offer greater value. Over the course of several months, Through a combination of negotiation and subtle threats, I arrived at a settlement that appeared to satisfy all parties. In reality, I tilted the outcome slightly in favour of one faction over the other, based on instructions from the King's Council that I had been given privately. But the settlement was presented as a fair and impartial resolution of the disputes, and all parties accepted it publicly, though I had no doubt that privately they understood exactly what had been done. What troubled me most during this time was not the manipulation or the calculation. I had become accustomed to that. What troubled me was the recognition that I was no longer a knight engaged in service of a just order. I was a functionary of power, a tool used by the king to maintain his control over territories that were increasingly difficult to govern. The orders I carried out were not orders for justice or righteousness, but orders to maintain the king's authority by whatever means necessary. And more troublingly, I recognized that I no longer had any clear understanding of what justice or righteousness might actually be. The dream returned to me several times during my time in the north. The field with the grey sky, the silent figures rising from the earth, the weight of their regard falling upon me. And with each repetition, the dream seemed to carry more meaning, as though it was trying to tell me something that I was resisting with all my will. I remained in the north for another year after the initial settlement, overseeing the administration of the king's will and dealing with various disputes that arose. During this time, I kept a small household with my men in a borrowed manor house that had been placed at my disposal. The house was cold and damp, situated on high ground so that it overlooked the surrounding countryside. From the windows I could see for miles in all directions rolling hills that grew steadily more wild and less cultivated as they stretched away to the north and east. This isolation, combined with the constant work and the endless negotiations, began to wear upon me in a way that nothing had worn upon me before. I developed a habit during this time of riding out alone in the early mornings, before my men were awake. I told myself that I was surveying the lands, that I was gathering intelligence on the state of the region. But, in truth, I was simply trying to get away from the weight of my responsibilities, even for a brief time. I would ride for hours into the hills, pushing the horse faster and faster until the physical effort consumed all my attention and left no room for thought. The cold air would burn my lungs, the muscles of my legs would scream with the effort of holding the saddle, and for those hours there was nothing but the present moment, the horse beneath me, the ground flying past, the wind in my face. It was during one of these rides that I encountered the old woman. She was standing by a stream at the bottom of a valley, beside a rough shelter made of branches and thatch. As I approached, she did not move or show any fear, though I was mounted and armoured and must have presented a formidable sight. She simply watched me come, with eyes that seemed to be looking through me rather than at me. I asked her what she was doing there, in such a remote and desolate place. She told me that she was collecting healing plants, herbs and roots that grew in the wild places, and that could be used to treat various ailments. She offered to show me some of them, pointing out plants that I would have walked past without noticing, explaining their properties with a certainty that suggested she had learned this knowledge over many years. We spoke for perhaps an hour. She told me that she had been a healer in a village some miles away, before a plague had swept through the region and many people had died despite her efforts to help them. After that, she had withdrawn from the village to live in the wild, saying that there was something about accepting payment for healing while so many died anyway that she could not bear. She lived now on the charity of people who sought her out when they or their livestock fell ill, and otherwise kept to herself. I asked her if she was not lonely. She looked at me as though the question surprised her, and then she smiled. She said that loneliness required expecting something different from what was actually present. She had learned to accept the world as it was empty of human company, but full of the small details of existence. The pattern of light through trees, the taste of clean water, the changing seasons. I did not know why I was so affected by this conversation. In the years that followed, I would think about it often, and I would never fully understand why the words of this old woman, who I never saw again, had such an impact on my understanding of things. Perhaps it was simply that she offered a vision of a life that was not predicated on striving, on advancement, on the endless pursuit of power and status. A life that was simply itself, without meaning beyond the fact of being lived. I rode back to the manor house in a strange state of mind, as though something in me had been disturbed and had not yet settled back into place. I gave orders that the woman was to be left alone, and that if she ever came to the manor seeking help, she was to be given whatever she needed. I never saw her again, but I left occasional gifts of food and wool at the place where I had met her. Whether out of charity or out of something else, I was not entirely sure. When I finally received orders to return south in 1390, I was simultaneously relieved and diminished. I had been away from my family for 2 years, though I had maintained some contact through letters. Margaret wrote to me of the children growing, of the management of my lands, of her own life proceeding without me. The letters were loving, but gradually became more resigned, as though she had accepted that I would never be the husband she had hoped for, but she had made a life for herself nonetheless. I felt no guilt about this, which perhaps speaks to the kind of man I had become. The journey south took me through the battlegrounds of the English Midlands. I passed through landscapes that I recognised from my youth, though they seemed changed older, more worn, less full of hope. The villages I passed through were smaller than I remembered, and the people I encountered seemed careworn and suspicious. This was not the England of my childhood, which I had believed in my youth to be a land of order and purpose and Christian virtue. This was a country that was being hollowed out from within, that was consuming itself through endless wars and internal conflicts. I arrived at court in the autumn of 1390. The king was in residence, and I was summoned to see him within a day of my arrival. Richard was now a man in his early 20s, and he had begun to display the kind of arbitrary power that young men given absolute authority sometimes develop. He had surrounded himself with favourites, men who had little experience of the world and whose advice he took without question. These men had developed a circle around the king that was increasingly at odds with the older nobility, who felt that their traditional privileges were being threatened. The king's greeting to me was warm, and he spent time thanking me for my service in the north. He asked about the settlements I had made and seemed pleased with my reports. He offered me a seat close to his own during the evening meal, a mark of favour that was noticed by everyone in the great hall. But beneath this warmth I sensed something dangerous. The king seemed unable to rest, moving constantly from one mood to another. He spoke rapidly, his thoughts jumping from one subject to another. He issued orders and then changed them hours later. He spoke of men around him as though they were objects to be manipulated rather than subjects to be governed. I recognized in him the signs of a mind that was beginning to come loose from reality, though I could not have articulated this at the time. One of his favourites, a man named Robert de Vere, who had been given an extraordinarily high position for one so young, took me aside one evening and suggested that the king wished to use me in a new capacity. There were concerns at court about the growing power of certain of the older nobility, particularly the Duke of Gloucester and the Earl of Warwick. These men, de Vere suggested, were becoming too influential, were beginning to make decisions without the king's direct involvement, were essentially ruling the realm while the king was occupied with other matters. De Vere suggested that the king wished to have trusted men in positions where they could gather intelligence on these great lords. He asked if I would be willing to take on such a role. He made it clear that this would require me to be in court more often, to cultivate friendships with men of power, to listen and observe and report back. This was, in short, a request to become a spy, not in the crude sense of employing people to follow others and watch their movements, but in the more subtle sense of using one's position and relationships to gather information that could be used to the king's advantage. This was not a new practice. It had been happening in courts since courts existed, but it was the first time I'd been asked directly to engage in it. I should have refused. I recognized even then that this was a crossing of a line that I had not yet crossed. Up until that point, I had been complicit in various corruptions and compromises, but they had all been in service of something that could at least be described as maintaining order, as serving the actual functioning of government. This was different. This was about using my position to betray the confidences of other men, to gather information that would be used to destroy them. But I did not refuse. Instead, I asked what would be required of me, what information was particularly being sought, and in that asking, I'd already agreed. De Vere smiled, as though he had known all along what my answer would be, and he explained that the king was particularly interested in the movements and communications of the Duke of Gloucester, He wanted to know what the Duke was doing, whom he was meeting with, what he was planning. Over the next several months, I began to attend court functions regularly. I cultivated the friendship of men who were close to the Duke of Gloucester. I listened to conversations. I attended Mass in the same chapel as he attended. Gradually, through these small acts of observation, I began to gather a picture of what was happening in the upper reaches of power. The Duke of Gloucester Thomas of Woodstock, a man in his 50s who had seen much warfare and much politics, was indeed concerned about the king's direction. He believed that the king was being misled by his favourites, that decisions were being made without proper consultation, that the realm was being governed poorly. Along with the Earl of Warwick and several other senior lords, he was considering whether action needed to be taken to restore proper governance. This was not rebellion exactly, not yet. But it was the preliminary stage before rebellion, the moment when powerful men begin to talk openly about the possibility that the king might need to be removed, or at least constrained. I reported this to De Vere. I reported the conversations I had heard, the meetings I had observed, the concerns that were being expressed. I watched as this information was taken to the king, and I watched as the king's response grew increasingly paranoid and angry. The distance between the king and the older nobility widened. Where there had been disagreement and discussion, there was now suspicion and hostility. In 1391, the crisis came to a head. The Duke of Gloucester and the Earl of Warwick, along with other powerful lords, confronted the king directly. They demanded that his favourite Robert de Vere be removed from power. They demanded that the king accept counsel from a formal council rather than governing through the whims of his chosen friends. They presented this as being in the interests of good government, but it was also a grab for power by the older nobility against the younger king. The confrontation was fierce but remained at this stage within the bounds of politics rather than open warfare. The king agreed to the removal of de Vere, though with visible reluctance and rage. A council was established to oversee the business of government. Order, of a sort, was restored. But something had broken in the relationship between the king and the older nobility. There was now distrust on both sides. The king blamed the lords for forcing him to act against his will. The lords believed that the king could not be trusted to govern fairly. And I, who had contributed to this conflict through my reports to de Vere, felt the weight of that knowledge settling upon me like a stone in my chest. It was during this period that my family life began to suffer irreparably. I'd returned home for brief periods between my periods of service at court, but I was increasingly estranged from Margaret and from my children. Margaret had developed a life of her own in my absence. She was involved in charitable works. She had a circle of friends. She managed my lands with efficiency and good judgment. She no longer needed me, or perhaps she had learned not to need me because she had understood that needing me was a pain she could not afford. My son, who was now in his teens, regarded me with polite distance. He knew me as the man who came home occasionally with gifts and stories, but he did not know me as a father. My daughter, who was younger, was actually afraid of me. The memory of my presence was something she had not maintained clearly, so when I returned, I seemed to her a stranger, and a stranger dressed in armour was not a comforting thing to encounter. I felt during these visits as though I was a ghost visiting the life I might have had if I had made different choices. I tried to connect with my children, to teach my son about the business of managing lands, to spend time with my daughter. But I was out of practice at ordinary life, and my attempts at connection felt awkward and forced. Margaret was kind about this, which somehow made it worse. Her kindness was the kindness one shows to a returning soldier who will never quite fit back into the life he left, and her politeness made clear that I was no longer truly part of the household. In 1393, I was in my 45th year. I had spent more than 30 years as a knight. My body was beginning to fail me in ways that I could no longer ignore. My left knee, which I had wrenched badly many years before during a fall from a horse, had developed a constant ache that was worse in cold weather. My hearing had begun to diminish. I sometimes had to ask people to repeat what they had said to me. My hands trembled slightly when I was tired, though they were still strong. More troubling than these physical changes were the changes in my mind. I was developing a kind of brittleness, a difficulty in concentrating on tasks that did not immediately engage me. I found that I was increasingly irritable, particularly with people who had not earned their positions through years of service, who seemed to imagine that the world owed them something simply because they were of noble birth. I was becoming, in short, the kind of man who is obsolete in the world that is being created. The dream had returned with increasing frequency. Almost every night now, I found myself standing in that grey field, watching the silent figures rise from the earth. The dream had evolved over the years. Now I sometimes recognized faces among the rising dead. I saw men I had known in campaigns long past. I saw men who had died in the course of my duties for the king. I saw men whose lives had been ended simply because their lords had decided it was necessary. And all of them looked at me with the same expression, not accusation, not forgiveness, simply the passive regard of those who had been consumed by history and were now witnessing how their consumption was being justified. I began to drink more heavily during this period. Wine was available in abundance at court, and I found that the right amount of wine could muffle the constant background noise of my own thoughts, could make it possible to pass through the evenings without too much awareness of what I was becoming. It was in this state, damaged, tired, drinking too much, increasingly aware that the life I had built was built upon nothing solid, that I made the decision that would define the final decades of my life. In the spring of 1394, as I was preparing to leave court for a planned return to my lands, I was approached by a man I had never seen before. He introduced himself as a priest and asked if he could speak with me privately. Curious, I agreed, and we withdrew to a small chamber that was mercifully empty. The priest, who would not tell me his name, told me that he was aware of the work I had been doing on behalf of the king. He told me that he was aware of my reports to De Vere, of the information I had gathered about the Duke of Gloucester and the other lords. He told me that he was aware of my role in the conflict that had arisen between the king and the nobility. He said this without any apparent judgment, simply stating facts as though they were common knowledge. I was alarmed, though I tried not to show it. I asked him what he wanted. He told me that he worked on behalf of certain parties, who had an interest in preserving the stability of the realm. He said that these parties were concerned about the direction that the king was taking, about the king's increasingly arbitrary use of power, about the danger that the realm would be torn apart by civil conflict between the king and the nobility. He suggested that I had a role to play in preserving stability, not by spying, not by gathering information rather, by withdrawing from court, by retiring to my lands, by ceasing to be available as an instrument of the king's will. He explained that my retirement would send a signal. Other knights would notice that I had withdrawn from favour. They would draw their own conclusions about the state of things at court. The king would perhaps wonder whether I had been approached by one of the great lords, whether I was now serving other masters. This uncertainty, this small crack in the king's network of supporters, might be enough to cause him to hesitate in his pursuit of absolute power. I asked the priest what would happen to me if I were to do this. He told me honestly that I would likely lose my position at court. I would probably be interrogated at some point about whether I had been turned by one of the nobility. My lands might be seized. My title might be stripped from me. Possibly, depending on how things developed, my life might be in danger. I asked him why I should agree to such a thing, why I should risk everything for a goal that was vague and unlikely to succeed. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then he asked me if I believed that what I had done in service to the king had been right. He asked me if I believed that the work I had done, the reports, the intelligence gathering, the subtle manipulations that had contributed to the conflict between the king and the nobility had been in service of something good. I did not answer, because I could not lie convincingly, and I no longer believed in what I had been doing. He said then that perhaps it was time for me to stop. Perhaps it was time to step back and refuse to be complicit any longer. He said that this might not change anything. The king would continue to rule as he chose. The nobility would continue to struggle for power. The realm would continue on its course. But at least I would no longer be pouring poison into the well from which everything flowed. He told me to think about what he had said. He told me that if I decided to withdraw from court, I should leave without announcement, should return to my lands and remain there, should make clear through my actions that I was no longer available for service. He said that others would understand what my withdrawal meant, and that it would be noticed. Then he was gone, and I was left alone in that small chamber, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in me. I spent 3 days thinking about what the priest had said. I considered all the reasons I should refuse. My lands, though substantial, required active management to maintain their value. My title was not so secure that I could afford to lose the king's favour. I was not wealthy enough to live comfortably without the stipends and gifts that came with my position at court. Withdrawing would be to condemn myself to a kind of semi-poverty, to remove myself from the world of power and influence that had been my life for so long. And yet, I was also exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. I was exhausted by the endless compromises, the endless calculations, the endless performance of loyalty to causes I no longer believed in. I was exhausted by the knowledge of the harm I had done, by the awareness that my intelligence gathering had contributed to the conflict between the king and the nobility, by the growing certainty that this conflict would eventually lead to violence. Most of all, I was exhausted by the person I'd become. I did not recognize myself anymore. The young man who had once dreamed of noble deeds and righteous causes was completely gone, replaced by someone who was calculating, compromised, and empty of any genuine conviction. I made my decision on the 4th day. I went to the king and requested permission to retire to my lands. I said that my health was failing, that I needed to spend time managing my estates and preparing them for my eventual passing. I made excuses that were polite and difficult to refuse directly. The king, who was occupied with other matters and did not find me particularly essential to his plans, granted my request without much resistance. I left court without fanfare or announcement. I rode to my lands with a small household of my most trusted men. And I have been here, in this remote corner of England, for the 6 months since then, trying to understand what I have done with my life, and whether any of it could be justified. The dream came again last night, clearer than it has ever been. I stood in the grey field and the silent figures rose around me as they always do. But this time, they did not simply look at me and turn away. This time, they approached me, and I saw their faces clearly. They were all men I had known. They were all men whose fates had been determined by my actions or by the actions of others like me. Some had been rebels against the established order. Some had simply been in the way. Some had been sacrificed to the needs of power. And as they surrounded me, I understood something that I've been resisting for all these years. Their silence was not accusation. It was not even forgiveness. It was simply the silence of those who understood something that I am only beginning to learn, that the structures we build to justify our actions, the hierarchies we create to explain why some men rule and others serve, the orders we speak of as though they come from God, all of these are simply the stories we tell ourselves so that we can continue to do what we are doing without too much awareness of what we are actually doing. The men in my dream were not angry at me. They were simply showing me what had been taken from them, not their lives merely, though that was part of it. What had been taken was the possibility of living in a world where things were as they seemed, where the words used to describe the order of things actually meant what they said, where a man could believe that his suffering served some purpose beyond the aggrandizement of those who held power. I woke from the dream with a strange sense of clarity, as though something had finally been resolved. I've been thinking all day about what I should do now, what it means to have withdrawn from service without having fundamentally changed anything. The king still rules, the nobility still conspire, the common people still suffer under the weight of obligations that have been placed upon them. My withdrawal has not prevented any of this. In fact, I do not know whether my withdrawal has accomplished anything at all. But perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is simply that I have stopped being complicit. I have stopped using my skills and my position to serve purposes that I no longer believe in. I have stopped telling myself stories about nobility and honour that I know to be false. This is a small thing, perhaps a meaningless thing, but it is the only thing that I have left to offer. I am sitting now in the hall of my manor house. It is autumn again, nearly a year since I left court. The light is fading outside and soon it will be dark. A fire burns in the hearth and the smoke curls up and out through the chimney. My hands are shaking slightly as I write these words. I do not know how much longer I have left to live. My body is failing in small ways, and I have no great desire to fight against that failure. But before I go, I wanted to set down this account, not because I believe it will change anything, not because I believe anyone will care about the reflections of an old knight who made compromises and then too late decided that he no longer wanted to make them. I write this because I want there to be a record somewhere of what it was actually like. Not the glamorous tales that are told in the great halls about the glorious days of chivalry, not the histories written by priests and scholars who speak of these times as though they were a grand stage upon which great deeds were performed, but the truth, the messy, complicated, disappointing truth of what it was actually like to live through these years, to wear the armour and carry the sword, to be part of a machine that claimed to serve justice but served only power. I want it known that there were men who felt this way and that they were right to feel it. I want it known that the order of the world is not as solid as it appears, that the hierarchies are not as natural as they are claimed to be, that beneath the words about honour and loyalty, there is only the naked exercise of power by those who are strong enough to exercise it. Most of all, I want it known that a man can live a long life in service to something he does not believe in, can make compromises that he believes are necessary, can tell himself stories that make sense of what he has done, and that eventually, if he is lucky enough to live long enough, he may come to understand that all of these compromises and stories were simply ways of avoiding looking directly at what his life actually amounted to. This is not a noble conclusion. There is no redemption here, no great act of sacrifice or courage that makes up for everything that came before. I have simply stopped. I have withdrawn from the game and I am waiting for death, hoping that in whatever comes after, I will be able to look upon what I have done with something more like understanding than I can manage now. The world will continue without me. The king will continue to rule, probably badly. The nobility will continue to struggle for power. The common people will continue to suffer. My withdrawal changes nothing, but at least I will not be there to help it happen. There is a knock at the door. One of my servants coming to tell me that dinner is prepared. The day is ending as all days end. The darkness will come, and with it will come sleep, and perhaps the dream will come again. Perhaps I will stand once more in that grey field and see the faces of the dead, and perhaps this time I will be able to stand among them without the burden of the elaborate justifications that I have been carrying for so long. This is the truth, as I have lived it. This is what glory amounts to, if you have the courage to look at it directly. This is what honour means when you strip away the words and the ceremonies, and look at what men actually do in the name of honour. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not ask for understanding. I ask only that this account be preserved, that it be known that there was a man who lived through these times and saw what was actually happening, and that he bore witness to it, however late that witnessing came. My name is Edmund Thorne. I was a knight of England in the late years of the 14th century. I served the king and the order. I did what was required of me, and I survived long enough to understand that I should not have done it. That is the only truth I have left to tell.